Untold Stories, Dogs, Demons, and Dark Shadows. The Possession of Milo Chapter 1. New Beginnings. Jenna took a deep breath, savoring the crisp, fresh Vancouver air. The transition to the Lower Mainland was a significant change for her and Mark, but it was a welcome one. As she turned her gaze to their new home, her heart fluttered with excitement and anticipation. Their dream home was a stately Victorian-era masterpiece. Ivy crawled up the sides, giving the house an antique charm. Large bay windows glinted under the morning sun, and the turret on the west wing added a romantic touch to its aesthetic. It seemed to be watching over the property. Beside Jenna, Mark was unloading their belongings from the moving van. "This place is incredible," he said, pausing to admire their new residence. "I still can't believe we got such a great deal." Behind them, Milo, their energetic Irish setter, yipped and pulled at his leash, eager to explore. Mark laughed, releasing the dog, who bolted towards the house, tail wagging wildly. "You think he approves?" Jenna grinned. "Oh, undoubtedly." Mark's eyes followed Milo. "But let's unpack first. I want our first night here to be perfect." Jenna nodded but was distracted when Milo started pawing at one of the lower windows. It was dusty and smeared from years of neglect. Peering closer, she realized the window provided a view into a room she hadn't noticed during their initial house tour. "That's strange," she murmured. "What is?" Mark walked over. "That room," Jenna pointed. "It's sealed off from the inside. We didn't see it when we looked around the house." Mark squinted at the window. "Probably just an old storage room or something. Maybe they planned on renovating it." Jenna wasn't convinced. There was an unease about that room, a sense of being watched. She shook her head, dismissing her fears. "Let's get inside. It looks like it might rain soon." They made their way to the front door. As Jenna pushed it open, a chilling gust of wind swept through the hallway, causing her to shiver. "It's going to need some insulation," she joked, though her voice wavered slightly. Hours passed as they unpacked and settled. Evening approached, and a soft rain began to tap against the windows. Jenna was setting up the living room when the doorbell rang. She opened it to find Lisa, a friend from town. "Thought I'd drop by and see how you two were settling in." Lisa smiled, though her gaze flitted uneasily around the property. "It's coming along," Jenna said, inviting her in. "It's a lot to unpack, but we're getting there." Lisa followed her in, glancing around with concealed apprehension. "It's a lovely home," she said, almost mechanically. "Very historic." Jenna laughed. "You sound like you're holding something back." Lisa hesitated, then sighed. "Look, I didn't want to say anything, especially not on your first day. But there have been stories about this house. Nothing concrete, just whispers, you know?" Jenna frowned. "What kind of stories?" Lisa shrugged uncomfortably. "Just that it's haunted. That the previous owners left because of strange occurrences. No one's lived here for a long time." Jenna's blood ran cold, remembering the sealed-off room. But then she shook her head. "It's just old town gossip, Lisa. Every old house has its stories." Lisa nodded, though she still looked unconvinced. "I just thought you should know. Anyway, I should get going. Let me know if you need anything, okay?" Jenna hugged her friend goodbye, her mind racing. She tried to brush off Lisa's words but couldn't shake the eerie feeling. As night fell, Jenna and Mark settled into bed, the rain providing a soothing backdrop. But just as sleep was about to claim Jenna, she heard a faint whisper, a voice that seemed to echo from the very walls of the house. "Welcome to the House of Secrets." Her eyes snapped open, heart pounding. She turned to see if Mark had heard it, but he was sound asleep. Pulling the covers up to her chin, Jenna tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. But as she drifted to sleep, she couldn't help but wonder what lay behind the sealed door and what secrets the house held. Chapter 2. The lockbox discovery. The rain persisted, each drop merging into a symphony of nature's somber moods. Jenna woke up early, the eerie whisper from the night before still etched in her memory. Shaking off the unease, she decided to spend the morning exploring the house further. As she meandered through the maze of rooms, she stumbled upon a door beneath the staircase. She felt a strange pull towards it. The door was old and battered, its paint chipping, revealing wood scarred by time. Taking a deep breath, Jenna carefully pushed the door open. It groaned, resisting movement as if it hadn't been touched in years. The room beyond was shadowed, sunlight filtering through gaps in the boarded-up window. Dust motes danced in the air, making Jenna cough. The room was barren except for a few old furniture pieces draped with sheets. However, what caught her attention was a peculiar, ornate lockbox sitting on a dust-covered table in the center of the room. Its craftsmanship was exquisite, with intricate Asian motifs engraved onto its surface. Jenna's heart raced. She remembered Lisa's words and felt a tingling sense of discovery. Before she could approach the box, Milo, curious as ever, dashed into the room. He went straight for the box, sniffing it with interest. Jenna reached out to pull him away, but before she could, Milo began to chew at the corners of the box. Milo! No! Jenna cried out, rushing forward. But it was too late. The lockbox sprung open, revealing its innards. A bone-chilling cold seeped out, filling the room, making Jenna's breath visible in the morning light. Milo, sensing the change, whimpered and backed away, ears flat against his head. The inside of the box was lined with velvet, and it was covered in unfamiliar, archaic symbols. These symbols seemed to move, writhing like living entities when Jenna tried to focus on them. Their patterns made her head throb. At the center of the box lay an old black and white photograph. It depicted a stern-looking couple, dressed in early 20th century clothing. They sat rigidly, staring unsmiling at the camera. The background showed the very house Jenna and Mark now lived in. The most unsettling part was the identical lockbox, prominently displayed between the couple. A sense of dread washed over Jenna. The room suddenly felt oppressive, as though the walls were closing in. The couple's eyes in the photograph seemed to follow her every move, their expressions accusatory. She carefully picked up the photograph, noting a faded inscription on the back, "May the spirits guide us. May the box keep us." The ambiguity of the message sent shivers down Jenna's spine. The chill in the room grew, and Jenna heard whispers, too faint to discern any words but loud enough to chill her soul. She quickly shut the box, hoping it would silence them. To her relief, it did. Jenna grabbed Milo, who was still trembling from the ordeal. She left the room hastily, shutting the door firmly behind her. She decided not to mention the discovery to Mark just yet. She didn't want to worry him unnecessarily. But she couldn't ignore the ominous sensation the lockbox stirred within her. As the day progressed, Jenna couldn't shake off the disconcerting feeling. She tried to distract herself with chores and house setup, but her thoughts continuously drifted back to the photograph and the lockbox. The stern faces of the old homeowners haunted her, their eyes seeming to hold a warning or perhaps a plea. By evening, when Mark returned from a quick trip to town for supplies, Jenna had resolved to discuss the box with him. Over dinner, she recounted the day's events, her voice quivering as she described the chilling sensations and the mysterious photograph. Mark listened intently, his initial skepticism replaced by concern as Jenna relayed the whispered sounds she had heard. They decided to consult a local historian or perhaps an antique appraiser the next day. There had to be a logical explanation behind the box and its eerie contents. But as night descended upon their new home, and as the rain outside grew heavier, Jenna and Mark couldn't help but feel that they had awakened something ancient and restless, something that had been waiting for a very long time. Chapter 3. Disturbing changes. The house was still as Jenna sipped her morning coffee, the overcast Vancouver skies lending an air of gloom to the room. Outside, a faint mist wrapped around the trees, making the world beyond the windows seem distant and faded. Mark was upstairs, setting up their home office. Jenna, left alone with her thoughts, couldn't shake off the eerie sensation from the previous day's discovery. The strange symbols, the cold aura, the photograph, they all haunted her thoughts. But what unsettled her more was Milo's abrupt change in behavior. Jenna noticed it first when Milo, usually eager for breakfast, refused to eat. His eyes, normally bright with mischief, now seemed distant, almost glazed. There was a persistent low growl, emanating deep from his throat, whenever he approached the door leading to the room with the lockbox. Throughout the day, Jenna watched with growing concern as Milo displayed unprecedented aggression. He snapped at thin air, barking ferociously at empty corners of the house. During one such episode, Jenna tried to calm him, only for Milo to snap at her, narrowly missing her hand. This was not the playful, affectionate dog she knew and loved. Night was even worse. Midnight howlings disturbed their sleep. Jenna would jolt awake to the disconcerting sound of Milo's mournful cries echoing through the hallways. It wasn't just a dog howling at the moon, it was filled with anguish, as if crying out in pain or maybe warning. One night, Jenna found Milo outside the sealed room, his fur on end, growling deeply. When she approached, he retreated but continued to growl at the door. On a whim, Jenna placed her hand on the doorknob, and the temperature dropped drastically. She jerked her hand back, watching as Milo skittered away, whining. Telling Mark was another challenge. She tried to explain Milo's erratic behavior, how it seemed intrinsically linked to the lockbox and its mysterious contents. Jenna, Mark began, rubbing his temples, it's just the stress of moving. New environment, new smells. Milo's just reacting to all the changes. And let's face it, that old box and photo have spooked you. You're reading too much into things. Jenna felt a twinge of frustration. Mark, this isn't just stress. Something's wrong. That box. I think it's brought something into our home. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. Jen, we can't let some silly urban legends get to us. Let's give it a few days. If Milo doesn't settle down, we'll see a vet. But Jenna wasn't convinced. She started researching the house's history, desperately seeking answers. Late into the night, she would sit surrounded by old newspapers and online articles, trying to piece together the house's enigmatic past. A week went by, and Milo's behavior worsened. The house seemed to come alive with strange sounds, soft whispers, footsteps, and distant cries. Jenna was sure they weren't alone. Objects moved of their own accord, shadows danced in the periphery, and cold spots appeared randomly. One particularly harrowing evening, Jenna was reading in the living room when she heard Milo's distressed barking. Rushing to the source, she found him outside the sealed room, more agitated than ever. But this time, he wasn't growling at the door. He was barking at the ceiling, his eyes tracking something Jenna couldn't see. Following his gaze, Jenna's blood turned to ice. Above, the ceiling seemed to ripple and undulate, as if something was moving underneath the plaster, something trying to break free. She grabbed Milo, rushing to find Mark. Bursting into the office, she relayed what she'd just witnessed, her words tumbling out in frantic succession. Mark, looking pale, finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. Okay, he whispered, we need help. As they huddled together, the house around them seemed to groan in agreement, the walls echoing with the murmurs of the past and the restless spirits bound within. Chapter 4. The first nightmares. Jenna, with Mark beside her, wrapped herself in the warmth of the duvet, the events of the day weighing heavily on her mind. Sleep, however, was reluctant to embrace her. She stared at the ceiling, every shadow morphing into sinister shapes. The rhythmic sound of Mark's breathing was a slight consolation, but it wasn't enough to quell the apprehension that lingered. Gradually, Jenna drifted into a restless slumber, and almost immediately, she found herself in a dream, or perhaps a memory. The room she stood in looked eerily familiar, the layout mirroring their own house, but the decor was dated, reminiscent of the early 1900s. Two figures, the stern couple from the photograph, stood across the room. Their mouths didn't move, but Jenna could hear them clearly. "Beware," the woman whispered, her voice like the wind rustling through dry leaves. "The box, it's more than it seems." The man, his eyes deep pools of sorrow, added, "We tried to contain it, to bind the spirit. But it seeks a vessel, always seeking." Jenna felt herself being pulled closer to them, the room growing colder. "What is it? What does it want?" she asks, desperate for answers. The woman's face contorted with pain and sadness. "Release," she murmured. "It wants to be free. And it will use your beloved to achieve its ends." Jenna's heart raced. "Milo?" she whispered in horror. The couple nodded solemnly, their expressions becoming more frantic. "You must act, and soon. Before it is too late." Suddenly, a sharp, malicious laughter echoed through the room, drowning out the couple's words. Shadows spread like ink in water, surrounding Jenna, their tendrils reaching out for her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the darkness threatened to engulf her entirely, Jenna was jolted awake, gasping for breath. The room was shrouded in darkness, save for the faint light filtering through the window. Jenna felt a weight on her chest, her heart still racing from the dream's intensity. She reached out for Mark, needing the reassurance of his touch. But before she could, a low growl pierced the silence. Milo stood at the foot of their bed, his silhouette outlined in the dim light. He was focused intently on the bedroom door, his body taut, hackles raised, teeth bared. The growl deepened, the aggression palpable. Following his gaze, Jenna's eyes darted to the bedroom door. It stood slightly ajar, and from the darkness beyond, she could hear soft, insidious whispers. Inching closer to Mark, she shook him awake. "Mark," she whispered urgently, "something's out there." Mark groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Jen, it's just the house settling. New place, new sounds." But Jenna persisted. "I had a dream, Mark. The couple from the photo, they were warning us about the spirit in the lockbox." Mark sat up, his face etched with concern, but not necessarily belief. "Jenna, we're both stressed. This move, the strange occurrences, it's playing tricks on our minds." Jenna looked at him, exasperated. "Mark," Milo's growling at the door. "That's not a trick." Mark glanced at Milo, then back at Jenna. "Okay," he said slowly, "let's check it out. Together." As they approached the door, the whispers grew louder, an incomprehensible cacophony of voices. Mark, trying to remain logical, reached out to open the door further, but Jenna held him back, fear evident in her eyes. "Mark, please. I'm begging you. We need to find out what's going on, but we need help. Real help." Mark stared into Jenna's eyes, the weight of her plea evident. "All right," he whispered, pulling her close. "We'll figure this out. Together." The couple retreated to their bed, the room now silent save for Milo's whimpers. But Jenna knew this was just the beginning. The spirit, whatever it was, had announced its presence, and it wouldn't rest until it achieved its malevolent desires. Chapter 5. Whispers of the past. The morning sun was a stark contrast to the ominous night. Bright rays filtered through the curtains, illuminating particles of dust dancing in the air. Jenna, her sleep disturbed by the chilling nightmares, was relieved by the arrival of day. She clung to the hope that the sunlight would dispel not only the darkness outside but also the dark shroud enveloping their home. After breakfast, Jenna stepped out into the garden, seeking solace in nature, only to find an elderly woman standing by the garden fence. Her silver hair was neatly tied into a bun, her eyes sharp yet burdened with age. "Good morning," Jenna greeted hesitantly, wondering if this was one of their new neighbors. The woman gave a curt nod. "You must be the new homeowner," she said, her voice raspy with age. "I'm Mrs. Atwood. Lived in the house next door for over 60 years. Jenna smiled, extending a hand. "Jenna, pleased to meet you. My husband, Mark, and I just moved in." Mrs. Atwood hesitated, her gaze piercing Jenna's. I saw. And with all due respect, dear, that might have been a grave mistake. Jenna felt a chill run down her spine, recalling the recent unsettling events. Why would you say that? The older woman sighed, her face grave. Have you ever wondered why this house was on the market for so long? Why the price was, well, quite lower than it should have been. Jenna nodded, her anxiety growing. Yes, but we thought it was due to age and a few renovation needs. Mrs. Atwood pursed her lips. Not just that. This house, it has a past. A troubled one. The family before you, the one in that photo you likely found, they were obsessed with the occult. The man, Douglas, believed in harnessing spirits, even controlling them. Jenna's eyes widened in realization. The lockbox? Mrs. Atwood nodded. He discovered that lockbox during one of his trips to Asia. It was said to be a vessel, capable of trapping powerful entities. Douglas, ambitious and blinded by obsession, attempted a dangerous ritual, aiming to trap a potent spirit. But rituals, especially ones involving the unknown, are treacherous. Instead of him controlling the spirit, it overpowered him. He and his wife vanished without a trace, but the house, it remained tainted. Jenna's heart raced. So, the spirit, it's still here? The older woman nodded gravely. And it's not just any spirit. It's vengeful, destructive, seeking release and retribution. The few who've dared to live here have either fled or, she trailed off, leaving the unsaid hanging heavily between them. Jenna swallowed hard, images of the night's events replaying in her mind. What can we do? Mrs. Atwood took a deep breath. I'd suggest you leave. Find another place, far away from here. Some forces are not to be trifled with. But our home, our investment. Jenna began, feeling overwhelmed. Mrs. Atwood placed a wrinkled hand on Jenna's. Some things are more precious than money or property, dear. And remember, whatever you do, keep that dog of yours close. Spirits, especially malevolent ones, tend to target the most vulnerable amongst us. Jenna nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. She thanked Mrs. Atwood, her mind racing as she headed back inside. The urgency to share this revelation with Mark consumed her. Finding him in the living room, she relayed everything. Mark, initially skeptical, couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. Okay, he said, taking a deep breath. We need to figure out our next move. But first, we need to protect ourselves and Milo. The reality of their situation set in, casting a shadow over their dream home. The whispers of the house's tormented past echoed around them, hinting at the impending storm that awaited. Chapter 6. Paranormal Prowess. The old house, with its creaky floorboards and narrow, window-lit hallways, always had a sense of mystique to it. But ever since the discovery of the Asian lockbox and its eerie contents, things took a distinctly chilling turn. Yet nothing was as unnerving as the sudden transformation of Milo, their once playful dog, who now acted as though he was connected to something beyond the veil. It started subtly. One afternoon, as Jenna sat reading in the living room, the landline rang. Before the sound echoed through the house, Milo had started barking at the phone, his hairs on end. Puzzled, Jenna picked it up, finding her mother on the other end, who she hadn't spoken to in weeks. How odd, Jenna whispered to herself, but tried to brush it off as mere coincidence. Then it happened again and again. The phone would buzz with a text, or there'd be a knock at the door, and each time, seconds before, Milo would react, a growl, a bark, an uneasy whine. It wasn't just limited to sounds. He'd often fixate on a particular corner of a room, growling softly, the fur on his back standing tall, as if sensing a presence that Jenna and Mark couldn't. One evening, as Mark was setting the table for dinner, he felt a sudden icy draft enveloping him, so cold that it made the hairs on his neck stand up. Confused, he checked the windows, all were shut. Moments later, a wine glass, previously set firmly on the table, slid off and shattered on the floor. Milo yelped, his eyes wide and filled with fear. But it was one fateful Saturday that everything escalated. Jenna and Mark had invited a few friends over for a small gathering. As the evening progressed and the house echoed with laughter and conversation, Milo began to grow increasingly anxious. Suddenly, the room went cold. So cold, in fact, that one could see their own breath. The jovial atmosphere quickly shifted to one of unease. Out of nowhere, the lights began to flicker. A glass vase on the mantelpiece levitated, hovering for a few seconds before it smashed to the ground. The guests, paralyzed with fear, looked around in horror. All the while, Milo barked furiously, fixating on the front door. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the room returned to its normal temperature and the lights stabilized. Needless to say, the party ended prematurely. Friends left in a hurried flurry of hushed whispers and anxious glances, leaving Jenna and Mark alone in the vastness of their haunted home, with only Milo's distressed whining as a constant. "Mark," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling, "something is terribly wrong. It's not just stories or mere coincidences. This is real." Mark, usually the skeptic, had to agree. The tangible evidence, the shared experiences of multiple witnesses, it was impossible to dismiss. "We need to find out what's going on," he asserted, "before things get worse." That night, as the couple tried to sleep, the house seemed alive. The air was thick, and every shadow seemed to dance. A cacophony of whispers echoed through the corridors, too indistinct to comprehend, but loud enough to be unmistakable. Milo, usually a ball of energy, now seemed perpetually drained, as if his newfound abilities were taking a toll on him. Yet, despite his evident exhaustion, he stayed vigilant, acting as a guardian against the malevolent forces at play. The dread Jenna and Mark felt grew with each passing day. The house they had once fallen in love with now felt like a prison, its walls closing in. The dark history that seemed so intriguing upon their move now weighed on them like a curse. But amongst all the chaos and terror, one thing was clear. Whatever spirit or entity was present in the house was not just malevolent but was growing in strength. And with Milo's strange, paranormal prowess, it was evident that their beloved pet was deeply intertwined in this terrifying mystery. They had to act, and fast. Chapter 7. The apparition. The evening was heavy with mist, and the glow from the street lamps barely pierced the thick fog that enveloped the lower mainland of Vancouver. The hush outside was only broken by the distant sound of waves crashing along the shore. Inside, however, the house was alive with a tense anticipation. Jenna sat in the dimly lit living room, paging through an old family album, seeking a distraction from her looming fears. The soft glow from the table lamp cast shadows that danced in sync with the flickering candle flames. Mark was upstairs, reading up on spiritual cleansings and protection rituals. As Jenna turned a page, a slight movement at the edge of her vision made her pause. She looked up, straining her eyes against the semi-darkness. At first, she saw nothing. But then, just as she was about to return to the album, she glimpsed a shadow moving along the hallway that led to the back door. Frozen in place, she watched as the shadow solidified into a translucent figure, appearing to be that of a man. It bore an uncanny resemblance to Douglas, the previous homeowner. His eyes, though faded and ghostly, bore a sad, desperate look. Heart pounding in her chest, Jenna watched as the apparition trailed behind Milo, who walked obliviously from the hallway to the living room, his tail wagging, seemingly in search of a toy. The ghostly figure reached out, fingers hovering mere inches from Milo, as if trying to touch or merge with the dog. Jenna's protective instincts kicked in. "No!" she shouted, standing up abruptly, her voice echoing in the otherwise silent room. Startled, Milo turned towards her, his ears perked up. But the apparition, disturbed by her outburst, shifted its focus from Milo to her. It advanced, the sorrow in its eyes now replaced with anger and malevolence. Unable to move, Jenna could only watch as the spectral figure closed in on her. It raised its hand, the fingers distorted and elongated. With a swift movement, it swiped at her, passing through her body. The cold was unbearable, like being submerged in icy water. The room around her swirled, darkness creeping in from all sides. From the distance, she heard Mark's voice, shouting her name. The weight of the apparition's touch began to fade, replaced by the warmth of Mark's hands, shaking her, trying to rouse her. Jenna gasped, her eyes snapping open. Mark looked pale, his eyes wide with horror. "Jenna, are you okay?" he cried, holding her face in his hands. Jenna nodded, though her voice was shaky. "I saw him, Mark. Douglas. He was here, trying to. I don't know, possess Milo?" Mark's eyes darted around the room, as if expecting the apparition to reappear. "We need to leave, Jenna. Now." As Jenna tried to stand, a sharp pain shot up her arm. Rolling up her sleeve, she found long, red welts where the ghostly figure had touched her. The realization hit them both like a ton of bricks. The entity wasn't just making its presence known, it was escalating its intentions. The couple knew they had to act fast. The spirit, no longer just content lurking in the shadows, was actively trying to harm them. Their dream home had turned into a nightmare, and they were ensnared right in the middle of it. Chapter 8. Research and realization. The library in downtown Vancouver was a sprawling structure, echoing with hushed conversations and whispers of turning pages. Jenna, armed with a notepad and a sketched copy of the symbols from the lockbox, scoured the occult section. The overhead lights gave off a soft glow, illuminating the dust particles that floated in the air. In a secluded corner, Jenna found what she was looking for, a thick leather-bound book titled Rituals of the Far East. With trepidation, she began flipping through the pages, her fingers brushing over detailed illustrations of rituals, talismans, and ancient symbols. It took hours of combing through the text, but finally, Jenna found a section detailing a specific ritual used to trap malevolent spirits. The symbols sketched in the book matched those from the lockbox. The narrative spoke of a forbidden ritual, one that could ensnare powerful entities but came with a warning. If done incorrectly, the spirit could turn on the summoner. More disturbingly, the ritual wasn't meant to be a permanent solution. The spirit, once contained, would constantly seek a host to free itself, growing stronger with each attempt. The trap was temporary, a last-ditch effort to buy time before finding a way to banish the entity permanently. As Jenna absorbed this information, the weight of her discovery pressed down on her. Milo's increasing bouts of strange behavior, the midnight howlings, and now the apparition, it was all making terrifying sense. The spirit, confined for who knows how long, was now asserting its dominance, trying to free itself from its ethereal chains. She noted down vital details about possible counter-rituals and protections. A particular passage caught her attention, speaking about the spirit's need for a bridge to the physical world, which often turned out to be an animal or young child, given their inherent innocence and vulnerability. As Jenna left the library, the sky had darkened, casting the streets of Vancouver in a twilight glow. The city's usual bustle seemed distant, drowned out by the urgency of her findings. She dialed Mark, updating him as she hailed a taxi. At home, things were even more chaotic. Milo was agitated, pacing the living room with rapid, erratic movements. His eyes, once filled with playfulness, now held a look of deep distress. Occasionally, he'd stop and growl at a particular spot, as if seeing something Jenna and Mark couldn't. Gathering their research, Jenna and Mark spread out on the dining table. Together, they pieced together the grim puzzle. The spirit trapped within the lockbox was now using Milo as its vessel, and with each passing hour, its influence was growing. "It's like a parasite," Mark murmured, his eyes scanning the texts Jenna had brought back. "It needs Milo to grow stronger, to manifest. We need to free him, Mark," Jenna's voice cracked, thinking of their beloved pet. "Whatever it takes." Mark nodded, determination in his eyes. "We will, Jenna. We will." But time was of the essence. With each passing moment, the line between Milo and the trapped spirit was blurring. The battle for their dog's soul had begun, and Jenna and Mark were at the epicenter of this supernatural showdown. Chapter 9. Spiritual Intervention. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of rain and damp earth. Mark had been awake most of the night, browsing through local forums and seeking advice from friends. Amid the maelstrom of fear and uncertainty, one name kept cropping up: Sylvia Moonshadow, a reputed spiritualist renowned for her ability to communicate with the otherworldly. Dialing the number he'd acquired, Mark's fingers trembled. The call was answered by a soft, yet authoritative voice. Moonshadow speaking. Explaining the situation briefly, Mark could hear the subtle change in Sylvia's tone when he mentioned the antique Asian lockbox. There was a momentary silence before she said, "Come to my place at 3 p.m. Bring the dog and the box. And be prepared. This won't be easy." Their meeting place was a small cottage nestled amidst the woods on the outskirts of Vancouver. The exterior was quaint, with ivy-covered walls and an old oak door. Wind chimes tinkled softly, and the air was thick with the scent of burning sage. Sylvia greeted them at the door, her silver hair flowing freely, and her eyes, an unusual shade of violet, seemed to pierce right through them. She gestured them inside, where the interior was a stark contrast to the conventional exterior. The room was filled with burning candles, and every available surface was covered with an array of crystals, talismans, and symbols. Sitting them down, Sylvia inquired about the events leading up to Milo's possession. As Jenna recounted their story, Sylvia occasionally nodded, her expression grave. When Jenna finished, Sylvia finally spoke. "The spirit you've unknowingly released is an ancient one. It had been trapped in that box after a failed ritual attempt. It seeks to complete what was interrupted. And now, with Milo as its vessel, it has found the perfect conduit to do so." Mark gulped. "So, what do we do?" Sylvia leaned back, her gaze distant. "This won't be a simple exorcism. This spirit has been trapped and angry for a long time. But first, we need to understand the ritual it wishes to complete." She fetched an old scroll from a wooden chest and spread it out on the table. The symbols matched those from the lockbox. This is an ancient ritual, used to amplify spiritual energy. When performed correctly, the spirit would have gained immense power, enabling it to manipulate the physical realm freely. Jenna whispered, her voice laced with dread, "It wants to become all-powerful." Sylvia nodded. "Precisely. And it will stop at nothing. Milo's possession is just the beginning." Mark clenched his fists. "There has to be a way to stop this." Sylvia locked eyes with him. "There is, but it comes with great risk. We have to perform a counter-ritual, using the same symbols and chants, but in reverse order. This ritual will not only expel the spirit from Milo but will also banish it forever." The room was silent, save for the soft crackle of the burning candles. Milo, lying in a corner, whimpered softly, sensing the gravity of the situation. Mark and Jenna exchanged a determined glance. "Let's do it," Jenna declared. Sylvia smiled, the first genuine smile they'd seen since they arrived. "Very well. Prepare yourselves, for tonight, we battle with the unknown." As dusk settled and the shadows grew long, the trio, along with Milo, gathered in Sylvia's ritual chamber. The stakes were high, and the air was thick with tension. The fight for Milo's soul and perhaps their very lives was about to commence. Chapter 10. The ritual's history. With the candles illuminating the dim room, Sylvia began setting up for a séance, placing a small circular table in the center of her chamber. Upon it, she positioned a lit candle, an ornate crystal ball, and a set of old tarot cards. "Before we proceed with the counter-ritual, we must first understand the spirit's motives and its history," Sylvia intoned gravely. "For that, we need a medium." She introduced the medium, a gaunt woman named Eileen, with raven black hair and sunken eyes that hinted at a lifetime of witnessing the arcane. Eileen's reputation in the spiritual community was legendary, having communicated with spirits since childhood. Milo, sensing the charged energy in the room, nestled close to Jenna, his eyes darting around nervously. Mark held Jenna's hand tightly, drawing strength from their bond. As Eileen took her place at the table, Sylvia began chanting in a language neither Jenna nor Mark recognized. The room's temperature plummeted, and the air grew dense with anticipation. With each passing moment, an ethereal hush descended, silencing even the whisper of the wind outside. Eileen's eyes rolled back, revealing only the whites. Her voice, when it emerged, was not her own, deeper, resonant, echoing with centuries of anguish. "Who calls upon me?" The voice emanated from Eileen but felt omnipresent, sending shivers down Jenna's spine. Sylvia, unflinching, responded, "We seek knowledge and understanding. Tell us your story." A long sigh, more of resignation than of relief, filled the chamber. "I was a monk, devoted to the spiritual realm, seeking enlightenment. But my pursuits led me to discover a ritual of power, one that promised dominion over the physical and spiritual planes. Enthralled by its potential, I endeavored to perform it." Eileen, or the spirit speaking through her, paused. "But I was betrayed. My fellow monks, fearing the repercussions of such power, interrupted the ritual. In their haste and ignorance, they did not banish me but trapped me within the very symbols I sought to wield." A hint of anger tinged the spirit's words. "Centuries I languished, my essence confined, my power waning. The passage of time and the weight of my imprisonment twisted my purpose and my mind. I became what you now witness, a spirit, wronged and vengeful." Jenna, her voice trembling, asks, "Why possess Milo? Why all this chaos?" The spirit's response was filled with sorrow. "I seek release. But my essence has merged with the raw, primal energy of the ritual. It has altered me, consumed my clarity. The dog, innocent and pure, was a beacon. Through him, I hope to complete what was started and be free." Eileen's form convulsed as Sylvia quickly chanted, easing the spirit's grip on her. Gradually, Eileen's normal demeanor returned, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Gasping for breath, Eileen warned, "The spirit, though wronged, is no longer what it once was. The anger and confinement have warped its essence. If released improperly, it could wreak unimaginable havoc." Mark's face paled. "What do we do now?" Sylvia, deep in thought, finally declared, "We must proceed with the counter-ritual but with utmost care. Understanding the spirit's history, we can perhaps appeal to its original, untainted self, guiding it towards the release it so desperately seeks." And so, with a newfound understanding of the tragic tale binding them all, they steeled themselves for the confrontation that lay ahead. Chapter 11. Milo's disappearance. The night was a peculiar shade of dark, a deep obsidian that seemed to drink in all the light from the crescent moon. Jenna and Mark were in the living room, poring over ancient scrolls and books on rituals that Sylvia had lent them, when they first noticed Milo's absence. Jenna looked up. "Have you seen Milo?" Mark, engrossed in his reading, responded absent-mindedly, "He was right here just a minute ago." But as Jenna's frantic calls for Milo echoed unanswered throughout the house, panic began to mount. Every darkened corner, every rustling curtain seemed to mock them, hiding potential horrors in its shadows. The old wooden floorboards creaked and groaned, but there was no sign of the familiar patter of Milo's feet. Mark called out, "Milo! Come here, boy!" But the chilling silence that met them was disconcerting. The large grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, each gong resounding with a solemnity that heightened Jenna's growing fear. "Something's wrong, Mark. I can feel it." Suddenly, from the far recesses of the house, a faint, almost inaudible sound reached their ears. It was a whine, unmistakably Milo's, emanating from the direction of the basement. Without thinking, Mark dashed towards the sound. Jenna tried to catch him, her voice laced with fear. "Mark, wait. We need to be careful." But he was already opening the door leading down to the basement. The darkness within seemed tangible, spilling out like a tangible entity. The only sound was that faint, sorrowful whining, drawing Mark inexorably in. As Mark descended, each step was a descent into an ever-deepening black. The normally familiar surroundings of the basement now seemed alien, distorted. All he could think of was Milo, his beloved pet, and the need to ensure his safety. Suddenly, as he neared the last step, a ghostly blue light illuminated the basement. At the far end, near an old, decrepit storage cabinet, was a shimmering apparition. It was the previous homeowner, his face contorted in sorrow, pointing towards the cabinet. But Milo was nowhere to be seen. As Mark took a hesitant step towards the apparition, the floor beneath him gave way. With a heart-stopping jolt, he found himself plummeting into a concealed pit beneath the basement, the walls of which were lined with sharp, protruding objects, remnants of some long-forgotten trap or perhaps a malevolent design by the spirit. Back upstairs, Jenna, sensing the danger, screamed, "Mark!" Her voice echoed eerily through the house, unanswered. She made her way to the basement entrance but was stopped by an invisible force, a wall of cold, chilling energy. The door slammed shut on its own, sealing Mark inside and Jenna out. Inside the pit, Mark, though bruised and battered, was miraculously alive. The blue ghostly light had followed him, revealing Milo, whimpering in a corner of the trap. The dog's eyes, usually warm and lively, now glinted with a mix of fear and recognition. But their reunion was short-lived. The spirit of the old homeowner began to materialize, more tangible and malevolent than before. The ritual, it whispered in a hollow, chilling tone. Complete it. Meanwhile, outside the locked basement door, Jenna, her heart pounding with fear and desperation, realized that confronting the spirit was inevitable. She had to find a way to save both Mark and Milo from the vengeful entity that had turned their dream home into a living nightmare. Chapter 12. The confrontation. The air in the house grew palpably colder. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering as though cast by an unseen flame. Jenna's thoughts raced. Mark was trapped below, and her dog was nowhere to be seen. But she was not defenseless. Sylvia had given her a small talisman, a silver amulet inscribed with runes, promising it held protective powers. With the amulet clenched in her hand, Jenna approached the sealed basement door. As she neared, a voice whispered through the wooden barrier, "You cannot save them unless you free me." "Who are you? What do you want?" Jenna's voice quivered but held firm. The voice was cold, ancient, and resonated with a bitterness born from years of entrapment. "I was wronged, trapped by the ritual your dog disrupted. Complete it, and I shall release them." Tears streamed down Jenna's face. "I don't know the ritual. Please, just let them go." A ghostly apparition slowly formed in front of Jenna. It was the spirit of the previous homeowner, ethereal, with a haunting sadness in its eyes. "You have the means to free me," it murmured, pointing to the talisman in her hand. Realization dawned on Jenna. The amulet was not just a protector, it was a key, an essential component of the ritual. Jenna's mind raced. She remembered the scrolls and texts scattered on the living room floor. They held the answers. She sprinted there, her heart pounding in her chest. Flipping through the pages, Jenna finally found a ritual, complete with incantations and specific instructions. The ritual would bind the entity once more, but the words suggested it wasn't about imprisonment, it was about reconciliation. Armed with newfound knowledge, Jenna went back to the basement door. With a deep breath, she recited the incantation, holding the amulet aloft. The entire house shook. The basement door burst open, revealing an intense blue light emanating from below. Jenna descended, each step drawing her closer to the unknown. The pit had transformed. Mark lay unconscious on one side, Milo whimpering beside him. In the center, the spirit floated, its eyes locked onto Jenna. The room pulsed with energy as Jenna began the ritual. The runes on the amulet glowed brighter with each spoken word. The spirit writhed, a cacophony of voices echoing its pain and anger. But Jenna persisted, her voice clear and unwavering. The final word left her lips, and the room was consumed by blinding light. When Jenna's vision cleared, the room was transformed. Mark was stirring, and Milo, now free of the spirit's influence, barked joyfully. The spirit of the previous homeowner stood before her, no longer malevolent but serene. "Thank you," it whispered, fading away, leaving the scent of fresh jasmine in its wake. Jenna, overwhelmed, hugged Mark and Milo tightly. The nightmare was over, but the memories of this haunting confrontation would stay with them forever. Chapter 13. The Gathering. Jenna knew that the brief moment of reprieve wouldn't last. The spirit was relentless, growing stronger and more malevolent. Her confrontation had only bought them some time. By dawn, Jenna was on the phone, reaching out to Sylvia, the spiritualist. She explained the ordeal and her discovery of the ritual. Sylvia, already well versed with the house's history, expressed grave concern. "You need to prepare for the ritual, but remember, it's not just about chanting words. It's a battle of wills." With Milo by her side, Jenna ventured to the attic. She recalled glimpsing ancient tomes and artifacts when they first moved in. Now, these could be her only hope. But as she climbed, a sudden gust of wind blew out the attic window, sending papers and dust swirling. Trying to maintain focus, Jenna started her search. An old, leather-bound book caught her eye, its title in a language she couldn't comprehend. As she opened it, horrifying visions took hold. She saw herself, Mark, and even Milo, in various stages of torment. They were bound, surrounded by flames, their screams echoing in a never-ending abyss. Jenna could feel the heat, the searing pain, and the crushing hopelessness. Snapping out of it, she realized the spirit was attacking her mentally, aiming to break her resolve. She clutched the amulet Sylvia had given her, the cool metal grounding her. With newfound determination, Jenna gathered the tomes, some dried herbs, and a peculiar dagger with inscriptions on its blade. Each item would play a part in the ritual. Returning downstairs, she found Mark, his face pale. "I saw them too, Jenna. The visions." She nodded, squeezing his hand for comfort. "We're close, Mark. We just need a few more things." Their next stop was an old apothecary in town. With the list Sylvia provided, they purchased rare ingredients: mandrake root, moonstone dust, and crow feathers. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with knowing eyes, wished them luck, sensing the dire situation. But the torment was far from over. On their way home, the skies turned a deep shade of crimson. Crows circled overhead, their piercing caws growing louder and more ominous. The streets grew empty, and an unsettling silence took hold. Upon reaching home, they found their once cozy living room transformed into a scene from a nightmare. Walls bled, and distorted faces appeared, crying out in agony. The spirit was growing desperate, pulling all stops to prevent the ritual. Jenna and Mark set up in the dining room, laying out the ingredients in a specific order. Following Sylvia's instructions, they began to chant. As the incantation grew in intensity, so did the chaos around them. The house trembled, and unseen forces tugged at their souls. But the couple held firm, their combined willpower forming a protective barrier. Hours seemed to pass, the boundary between reality and the spirit realm blurring. And then, as suddenly as it started, everything ceased. A calm settled over the house, but Jenna and Mark knew better than to think it was over. This was just the beginning, the calm before the storm. The final ritual, which would decide their fate, was still to come. Chapter 14. The ritual. The dining room, once a symbol of warmth and family, was transformed into an arcane battleground. With Sylvia's instructions echoing in her head, Jenna set the stage. A circle of salt surrounded them, with intricate symbols etched at every compass point. The gathered ingredients lay in a delicate arrangement in the circle's center. In the dim candlelight, the tomes she found earlier cast long, eerie shadows against the walls. Sylvia had warned her of the backlash the spirit would produce. The closer you get to completing the ritual, the more desperate and violent it'll become. Milo, who had been calm since Jenna's confrontation with the spirit, now whimpered, his eyes darting around as though seeing invisible specters. Mark held the dog close, whispering comforts. "We're getting you back, buddy," he murmured, more to reassure himself than Milo. Jenna began the incantation, her voice unwavering. As the words filled the room, a palpable tension took hold. The very air felt thick, electric. The candles flickered wildly, casting chaotic shadows. The room's temperature plummeted, each exhale visible in the cold. The house groaned in protest. First, a whisper, then a roar. Walls shook, the floor vibrated, and from the depth of the house, an anguished scream echoed, a wail of sheer torment and rage. Mark tightened his grip on Milo, who began to thrash violently. His eyes rolled back, revealing only whites. A deep, guttural growl emanated from the dog, something far from natural. It was as if two souls were battling within him, the sweet pet they loved and the tormented spirit desperate for release. Objects in the room levitated, swirling in a tornado of paranormal fury. Books, chairs, even the heavy dining table lifted off the ground. Jenna persisted, her voice rising above the chaos, every word of the ritual a beacon of hope. Suddenly, an apparition materialized opposite Jenna. It was the previous homeowner, distorted and twisted in rage and sorrow. "Stop," it bellowed, "you don't understand. You will doom us all." Jenna faltered for a second, the weight of the responsibility crashing down on her. She locked eyes with Mark, his gaze filled with determination and trust. Drawing strength from him, she resumed, her voice now laced with power and conviction. Milo's body levitated, hovering over the circle. The spirit inside him fought ferociously, but the pull of the ritual was relentless. From the dog's mouth, a shadowy wisp began to emerge, slowly, agonizingly. The room's tumult reached a deafening crescendo, every ounce of energy focused on the battle at its center. With one final, ear-splitting scream, the spirit was wrenched free, the shadowy essence caught in the vortex created by the ritual. The house trembled as if in the grip of an earthquake. Then, in a blinding flash, the spirit was sucked into the lockbox, its prison once more. Silence ensued. Milo's limp body fell gently onto the floor. Mark rushed forward, cradling the dog, his eyes searching for any sign of life. A beat, then two, and Milo stirred, a soft whimper escaping his lips. He looked around, confused, then his eyes settled on Jenna and Mark, recognition and warmth flooding back. Jenna, drained but relieved, looked around the room, taking in the aftermath. The house, sensing the spirit's imprisonment, seemed to sigh in relief. Sylvia's voice broke the stillness. "You did it. But remember, the lockbox must never be opened again. Ensure it remains sealed." Mark, tears of joy and relief in his eyes, nodded. "We'll keep it safe. No one will suffer because of it again." As the trio, reunited, embraced, they knew they'd faced pure evil and emerged victorious. But the scars of the ordeal would remain, a haunting reminder of the fragile boundary between the living and the supernatural. Chapter 15. Mark's test. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps. The dank, cold basement around him felt like an entirely different realm. The only source of light was a single, flickering bulb that swayed from the ceiling, casting a dim hue upon old, rotting wooden shelves and discarded heirlooms. Suddenly, the walls began to close in. Or was that just his imagination? Panic surged within him as he felt the weight of his fears physically manifesting. He remembered Sylvia mentioning that the spirit could manipulate perceptions, twisting reality into grotesque versions of one's worst nightmares. The dim light was suddenly overpowered by a crimson glow. Mark squinted against the harshness, only to reel back in horror. Before him stood an apparition of Jenna, or at least something that looked almost like her. Her face was gaunt, eyes lifeless and hollow, and her voice. It was a mournful, soul-shattering lament. "Mark, why didn't you save me?" She moaned, reaching out with skeletal fingers. Heart pounding, Mark stumbled backward, only to find another horror awaiting him. An illusion of a mangled Milo lay whimpering, with a voice that whispered, "You failed me, master." Despair gripped him. But amidst the flood of terror, a singular, clarifying thought emerged: Milo. The real Milo was still somewhere, waiting for him, relying on him. Their bond, years in the making, was not something a malevolent spirit could replicate or sever. Rallying his strength, Mark focused on a cherished memory: the first time they brought Milo home, the way the young pup licked his face, and the warmth of that embrace. Grasping onto that memory like a lifeline, Mark yelled, "You're not real." The illusions wavered for a moment, but then grew even more menacing. Jenna's specter floated closer, her face contorted into a nightmarish scream. The twisted version of Milo snarled and lunged. Bracing himself, Mark thought of the genuine moments with Jenna and Milo. Their evening walks, the cozy winter nights, the shared joys and sorrows. With every memory, the apparitions began to falter, becoming more translucent. "I know my family. You can't deceive me," Mark shouted, his voice echoing through the basement. Suddenly, a real, familiar bark pierced the air. Mark's head whipped around to find the real Milo, standing at the top of the stairs, barking insistently. His heart swelled with relief and gratitude. Milo's presence, his genuine concern, was enough to dispel the last of the nightmarish illusions. The basement, once a prison of horrors, returned to its mundane, dusty state. The oppressive weight lifted, and Mark felt an overwhelming relief. He raced up the stairs, scooping up Milo in a tight embrace. "We did it, buddy," he whispered, nuzzling the dog. Together, they emerged from the basement, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, their bond stronger than any malevolent force. Chapter 16. The entity's true form. The ancient room in which the ritual was being conducted was laden with an oppressive air. Jenna, with sweat-drenched hair clinging to her face, chanted the final lines. The spiritualist beside her kept a protective circle of salt and sage around them, the fumes rising in serpentine tendrils, creating an almost ethereal barrier. The room grew colder. Shadows on the walls seemed to twist and turn into grotesque shapes, each more horrific than the last. With a final, piercing scream from the spiritualist, the room was plunged into darkness. The only light emanated from the center of the room where the opened lockbox lay. From the abyssal darkness, a shape began to form. At first, it was a mere wisp, a thread of smoke. But as seconds ticked by, it grew, coalesced, and solidified. Before Jenna stood a towering, monstrous figure. Its eyes, deep pits of eternal suffering, bore into her, while its skeletal hands, adorned with razor-sharp talons, reached out as if hungry for her soul. Jenna's heart raced. She had seen many things since moving to the house, but nothing compared to the sheer terror of this moment. "You think you can bind me again?" The entity hissed, its voice echoing with centuries of anguish. "I've waited, bided my time, and now you think you can push me back into that prison?" Jenna, summoning all her courage, replied, "We want our dog back, and you need to be free." "But not like this." The entity laughed, a sound so cold and mocking it sent shivers down Jenna's spine. "Freedom? I offer you a chance. A simple deal." The spiritualist, understanding the dangerous territory they were venturing into, began to murmur a protective chant. Jenna, however, was transfixed by the entity's gaze. "You want the mutt? And your dear husband too? I offer you both. In exchange for something fresh." The entity's voice grew softer, more seductive. "Your unborn child's soul." Jenna gasped, instinctively touching her belly. How did it know? She was barely a few weeks pregnant, a fact only known to her and Mark. "You see," the entity continued, "this child, with its pure, untainted soul, can grant me the freedom I crave. In return, I will leave your lives forever." Tears streamed down Jenna's face. The choice was impossible. Her family or her unborn child? The spiritualist, sensing Jenna's internal struggle, whispered urgently, "Do not listen." It seeks to manipulate, to deceive. Jenna, with a newfound resolve, stepped forward, facing the entity head-on. You will not have my child. We will find another way. The entity roared, the sound shaking the very foundations of the house. Then suffer the consequences. It lunged at Jenna, but the spiritualist, with a swift movement, threw a vial of holy water at it, causing it to recoil in agony. The room was filled with blinding light, and the entity's form began to disintegrate, becoming once again a wisp of smoke. But its voice, full of venom and rage, lingered. This isn't over. I will be back for what is mine. As the darkness receded and the room returned to normal, Jenna collapsed, exhausted but determined. The battle was far from over, but for now, they had won a crucial fight. The safety of her family, and her unborn child, was paramount, and she would stop at nothing to protect them. Chapter 17. Milo's sacrifice. In the aftermath of the confrontation with the entity, the house seemed to regain some semblance of calm, but Jenna was all too aware that it was the calm before another storm. The entity was wounded, not defeated. Mark, having been released from the basement's hold, reunited with Jenna. Their reunion was brief, the danger still very much present. Both could feel the suffocating dread, knowing the entity would return, hungrier and more furious than before. Their fears weren't unfounded. A few hours later, as they tried to recoup and plan their next move, an ear-piercing howl echoed through the house. It came from Milo. Rushing to the living room, they found Milo, his body contorted in agony, surrounded by a swirling vortex of dark energy. The entity, unable to possess Jenna, had turned its full attention back to Milo. But something was different this time. Milo's eyes, previously glowing with a demonic energy, now bore an emotion so profound it caught Jenna and Mark off guard: determination. Milo? Jenna whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Mark held her back, fearing the worst. With another howl, more desperate this time, Milo lunged at the dark energy. It was a scene of chaos, the dog and the entity, locked in a fierce battle, each trying to overpower the other. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that Milo, driven by his love for Jenna and Mark, was gaining the upper hand. The room, which had turned frigid with the entity's presence, began to warm. The dark energy, previously a thick, all-consuming force, started to wane. But victory came at a cost. With a final, triumphant bark, Milo forced the entity back into the Asian lockbox. But the effort, the sheer force of will it took to overpower the entity, had drained him. As the lockbox clicked shut, Milo collapsed. Jenna and Mark rushed to him. Milo, his breathing ragged, licked Jenna's hand weakly. In his eyes, there was a look of contentment, of a job well done. Tears streamed down Jenna's face as she cradled Milo's head. You did it, boy, she whispered. You saved us. Mark, unable to speak, simply hugged them both, the weight of their ordeal pressing heavily on him. The house, sensing the departure of the malevolent entity, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a serene calm. But the victory was bittersweet. Milo had made the ultimate sacrifice, using every ounce of his strength to protect his family. Jenna, cradling Milo's lifeless body, looked at Mark. We need to make sure that thing never gets out again, she said, determination stealing her voice. Mark nodded, tears in his eyes. We will, he promised. For Milo. The couple, united in their grief and resolve, set out to ensure that the entity, now trapped once again in the lockbox, would remain imprisoned for eternity. And as they did, a soft, ghostly bark echoed through the house, a final farewell from their loyal companion who had given everything to protect them. Chapter 18. The ritual's completion. The sudden absence of Milo, the heart and soul of their family, left Jenna and Mark in a state of deep sorrow. Yet, they knew they had to act swiftly. The ritual needed to be completed, the entity needed to be sealed away for good. Drawing upon the knowledge she had gathered and with guidance from the spiritualist, Jenna started to set the scene. A pentagram made of salt was laid in the center of the living room, At each point, she placed a symbolically charged item: the lockbox, a relic from the previous homeowners, a vial of her own blood, a strand of Mark's hair, and a toy of Milo's. Mark watched, tears in his eyes, heart heavy, but silently offering his support. This was the endgame, and they both knew the stakes. Jenna began to chant the ancient verses she had learned, each syllable echoing with a gravity that seemed to tug at the very fabric of the world. As she chanted, Mark could see the individual items in the pentagram start to glow, the combined energies creating a nexus of power. However, it was clear the entity was not going to go quietly. The house began to shake violently. Shadows swirled, merging and twisting to form menacing shapes, clawing at the protective circle Jenna had drawn around them. The temperature dropped sharply, their breaths visible in the chilling air. Phantom whispers echoed, trying to break Jenna's concentration. Mark grabbed onto Jenna, holding her steady, adding his own voice to the chant. Their combined willpower fortified the ritual. But then, in a cruel twist, the entity played its trump card. Mimicking Milo's bark, it tried to exploit their raw grief, hoping to throw them off balance. Jenna's voice faltered momentarily, tears streaming down her face. But Mark squeezed her hand tightly, offering strength. Pulling from her deepest reserves of determination, Jenna shouted the final verses of the ritual. The room was bathed in an ethereal, blinding light. Every shadow, every chilling gust of wind, every malevolent force was repelled by it. And then, as quickly as it began, everything stopped. Deafening silence. The pentagram's glow faded, leaving only the remnants of the ritual's ingredients behind. The house felt different, lighter, free of the malignant presence that had tormented them. Mark and Jenna, exhausted, fell into each other's arms, their ordeal finally over. The entity had been sealed, its malevolent intentions thwarted by their love and determination. The silence was broken only by their shared tears, a mix of relief, grief for their lost companion, and hope for a future without shadows. Chapter 19. Aftermath. In the dim light of dawn, the once ominous house stood serene. The twisted energy that had plagued its halls, turning it into a prison of fear, had vanished, replaced by a stillness that seemed almost out of place given the horrors that had transpired. Mark and Jenna were huddled together on the living room floor, their eyes heavy, bodies bruised, and minds grappling with the events of the night. In the midst of their exhausted embrace, a weak but familiar whimper caught their attention. From the shadows, a disheveled and tired Milo emerged, his tail wagging feebly. Jenna's eyes filled with tears as she rushed to him, wrapping her arms around the weary dog, feeling the warmth of his body, the rhythmic beat of his heart. The trio, having endured an unimaginable nightmare, were finally together again. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the curtains, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Gone were the cold spots, the shadowy corners, and the eerie silences. Instead, the rooms were bathed in a warm glow, the air fresh, and the walls echoing the soft sounds of a family reunited. But the relief was juxtaposed with a raw realization. The couple began to process the depth of what had transpired. The antique lockbox, the previous homeowners, the ritual, it all began to sink in. The house held memories, both good and bad, and they had become a part of its storied history. As Mark walked through the rooms, he noticed subtle changes. The sealed room where Milo had discovered the lockbox stood open, now revealing an old study filled with dusty books and manuscripts. It was as if the house itself was offering its secrets now that the malevolent force was no more. Jenna, meanwhile, busied herself with tidying up, needing the normalcy of mundane tasks. As she moved about, she stumbled upon the old photograph they'd found in the lockbox. It now seemed harmless, a mere memory from a bygone era. Yet, it served as a chilling reminder of the dangers of dabbling in the unknown. Milo, having slept off his exhaustion, was soon back to his playful self, though every now and then, he'd pause, looking into a corner as if remembering something, then shake it off and return to his toys. The day wore on, and the couple, surrounded by boxes still unpacked, decided it was time to truly make the house a home. They painted over the old symbols, refurbished the sealed room into a cozy library, and even placed the old photograph in a frame, a tribute to the home's history. By evening, as the sun set and the house bathed in a golden hue, Mark, Jenna, and Milo sat in the garden. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, the chirping of birds, and a profound sense of peace. But as night approached, the couple couldn't shake off a nagging feeling. The entity was gone, but the scars of the ordeal remained. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every shadow seemed to remind them of the haunting. As they settled into bed, Mark whispered, "Do you think it's truly over?" Jenna, holding Milo close, replied, "I hope so. But we'll face it, whatever comes our way, together." And as the night deepened, the house stood still, its walls holding within them tales of horror and heroism, of love and sacrifice. The aftermath of the haunting was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the bonds that tie us to those we love. Chapter 20. New Beginnings. Again, the decision was unanimous. Jenna, Mark, and Milo needed to move on. The scars, both mental and physical, were deep, and every corner of the house served as a stark reminder of the terror they had faced. They packed their belongings, but this time, the process was heavy with mixed emotions. For each cherished memory created within these walls, there was a counterpart of horror. Jenna quietly placed the framed photograph of the old homeowners on the mantel, a nod to the history they had unwillingly become a part of. The lockbox, however, they chose to leave behind, closed and resting silently in the room where it had been discovered. The trio decided its malevolent contents should remain locked away forever. The day of the move was somber. As they loaded their belongings onto the moving truck, Mark looked up at the house. Its grandeur was unmistakable. The architecture and design still spoke of an era gone by, of opulence and pride. But the shadows cast by the tall spires seemed to hide secrets, almost as if the house itself was a living being, waiting, watching. Neighbors, having caught wind of their departure, came to bid them goodbye. Most exchanged casual pleasantries, but a few, older residents who had been around long enough to know some of the house's history, shared knowing glances, their eyes clouded with relief and concern. Mrs. Higgins, the octogenarian from 2 houses down, approached Jenna. "I hope you found what you were looking for," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jenna simply nodded, not quite understanding but appreciating the sentiment. As the moving truck pulled away, Milo barked, his eyes fixated on the topmost window of the house. Jenna followed his gaze and felt a cold shiver. There, for just a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a figure, watching them leave, its outline blurry and indistinct. Mark, sensing her unease, squeezed her hand. "We're leaving it all behind," he whispered. The house, now vacant, stood silent, a sentinel overlooking Vancouver's lower mainland. Over time, the tales of its haunted past would become the stuff of legend, whispered among teens daring each other to venture close on moonless nights, discussed in hushed tones at neighborhood gatherings. New families would come and go, drawn by its undeniable charm and beauty. The lockbox would be discovered and discarded, its history unknown to new occupants. Some would speak of strange occurrences, of cold spots and unexplained noises. Others would dismiss these tales as mere urban legends, the products of overactive imaginations. But the house, with its rich tapestry of history, would stand the test of time. And within its walls, the echoes of the past would remain, waiting for the next chapter in its ever-evolving story. For Jenna, Mark, and Milo, their journey took them to a quieter part of town, a place where they could heal and rebuild. Their bond, having been tested in the most unimaginable ways, emerged stronger. They would often speak of their time at the old house, sometimes with trepidation, sometimes with a sense of wonder. But one thing was certain, they had survived, and their story, like the houses, would be passed down, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unspeakable horror. We hope you have enjoyed our storytelling offering tonight. Please be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to be alerted of future weekly additions to our collections. Paranormal Untold Stories.